Hi, welcome to the webinar. Today we are I am visited by, that sounds like you're a ghost, Tom. Today I'm visited by Tom Campbell, who you'll meet shortly. I should always introduce you like that. And we're excited you're here. Let me give you the quick overview of the things that we're going to cover and do, and then we're going to get right into it because we heart efficiency. So first, we're going to talk about what is a sane college application timeline. What things should you be doing by when? Tom's going to talk about values and why they're so darn important and why we heart them at CEG. CEG, by the way, stands for College Essay Guy. Hi, I started College Essay Guy. I'm Ethan. Great to meet you. And then we're going to talk about other parts of your application, like, the activities list and the additional information section, which might be brand new to you, and supplemental essays, which you've maybe heard about, but you're not quite sure what they are yet. And maybe if you want to talk about COVID in your application, but you don't necessarily have to, how do you do that? And along the way, we've got our rad moderators, Renee and Ashley, supporting, and they are grabbing your questions and putting them on a top secret behind the scenes Google Doc for us, which is not very top secret not anymore. So feel free to throw your questions into the chat. And with that, I think we'll get started. Tom put a form in. In case you missed it, you just joined us. If you fill out the form, we're going to choose somebody to get get a free book. PSAs, I didn't mention PSAs. We've got a course coming up. I'm teaching a course this summer on how to write a personal statement. A link is going to auto-magically appear. I'll share a little bit more about it at the end, but I'm teaching a course on the personal statement, which we talked about on Tuesday, and then all of the elements of the application, so that by the end of the summer, our hope is that you've got a sense of you've basically created a draft of your application for colleges. That's our hope, our goal, our mission. Yeah, more than our hope. That's actually our plan, is to help you finish a draft over the summer. And those courses are pay what you can, which is really important to know, which means that we don't want there to be any barrier to financial access for anybody. So you can join no matter what. And then we've got a course for counselors that we're starting, that Sanjay Mitchell, who's amazing, is leading on how to design and run an effective counseling program. And also a link to that will automatically appear in the chat. I think those are the things. So let's jump right in. So the first thing is application timeline. And I want to say that it's hard to do a one size fits all in terms of this is what everybody should be doing exactly. So the way we've split it up, let me just share my screen real quick. The way we've split this up is kind of like this. So if you're a ninth grader, and let me just do this based on, because we'll share this link out in the chat, but the way this maps out is we've split it up by grades. And if you're in ninth grade right now, and you're thinking ahead, what should I be doing right now? First of all, welcome, you're joining early, and we're glad you're here. But part of this is the exploration time. And it's meaning as you're heading into the summer, figuring out what are those cool things that you're into that you might like to explore. And we've got some exercises like the values exercise and personality assessments to help you figure out more about yourself and learn who you are. This is not the time to be stressing about, for example, standardized tests. It's too early. In 10th grade, again, we feel like it's a good time right now to be, again, sort of exploring, doing some exercises. We did a couple on Tuesday, and thinking about, what you're into and what you might like to explore over the summer. But again, it's not a time to be stressing about essays or applications. It's great that you're here to learn about what's in store for you, but this is not the time to be pre-writing essay drafts, because you're probably going to change and grow a lot and end up rewriting those anyway. What some of the tips that we give, and by the way, Ashley, Renee, could we make our little tiny squares slightly larger? We end up being so tiny in the corner here. If you want to start checking out schools or going to college fairs, that's an awesome thing to do right now. So in terms of right now, thinking about, okay, do I want to visit, for example, a large public school? Maybe there's one near you that you could check out. And then maybe you could also see a smaller private school, just to kind of get the vibe of what those are like. Those would be awesome things to do over the summer. Tom and I did a whole different webinar not too long ago, which is on our YouTube channel, about how to make the most of your summer. But essentially, thinking about exploring colleges, kind of doing some light shopping is a good thing to do. 11th graders, probably, as Tom said, most of y'all are in the 11th grade, so I'm going to get a little bit more specific here. Let me fast forward to where we are right now. We're sort of in the springtime, and so thinking about, and it's getting into summer, thinking about testing, picking your testing dates is a great thing to be doing right now. if you're an athlete or a performing arts student, starting to put together your materials, your resume, your video, if you're an athlete, or looking at what different schools require for auditions and portfolio. And then summer, we think this is an awesome time to be doing research, doing reading, internships, also, of course, fun stuff like hanging out with your friends. It's the last summer before college. And a big thing that we love to encourage students to do is be thinking about their college list right now. So we've got a whole blog on this that's going to walk you through step by step. And we just finished a course actually on helping you develop a college list. But the big thing that we're focused on is like thinking about your personal statement, which is what we started talking about on Tuesday, and finishing your common application, essentially, which we're going to get into the details of in just a little bit, so that you set yourself up in senior year for writing those supplemental essays, which we'll also talk about more specifically in just a little bit. Maybe you're doing interviews once you've submitted your applications. Not all schools are going to have interviews, but some schools might. And by the way, doing awesome writing on your essays is going to really set you up beautifully for all of those interviews if you end up doing them. Ooh, our screen is we are awesomely large now. And then, different students are going to have different application timelines. Some students are going to be applying early, which in those early applications are usually due in sort of like, some of them are due like in mid-October, but usually they're like November 1st, November 15th. And then the regular decision applications are going to be usually, January 1st. So you can kind of, if you're wanting to kind of think ahead of this, you're probably by January 15th or so, you're probably going to have all your applications in. But for those of you who are going to be applying early action, early decision, which we can get into a little bit today, but there's also a blog on that. You're going to maybe want to be, wrapping things up essentially by September, October for your first schools that you're applying to. And the reason we're such fans, but let me go through the rest of it. You'll end up getting decisions back from schools, usually, March and April. Maybe you'll visit a school or two that you've been accepted to. And then you'll usually decision date is May 1st. That's when you'll know where you're going. So fast forward a year from now, I know it's hard to believe, but you're going to actually probably know where you're going to school. And the reason when we say sane application timeline, we feel like it's a really good time to be thinking about essays over the summer, because in fall, like just to zoom up real quick, if you're just starting your application stuff in that August, September time, it can be pretty stressful given that you're going to be focused on your heaviest extracurricular load, thinking about, I'll stop sharing my screen for a second because I don't need to be sharing, thinking about, your biggest leadership opportunities, etc. So big fans of starting in the summer. Tom, did I miss anything? Anything to add there? Thoughts?
No, I feel like that's a pretty good general overview for a broad audience. And then of course, if any of you have more specific questions around like, I've been thinking about this part of the application process a lot, and I'm just wondering when I should fold that in or whatnot, you can definitely feel free to ask us in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll be sure to try to cover as many as we can in the time we have.
To set us up here, we talked a little bit about this on Tuesday, but I want to give context for these different elements of the application, because students are sometimes like, what do colleges even look for? What do they care about? Now, we have a report, but it's old. It's from like 5 or 6 years ago with what colleges care about most. And I want to, again, give the caveat that like, this is not the current version, but some of it will be similar and some of it has changed. So as of a few years ago, when colleges were asked, what do we care about most? Colleges gave considerable importance, most colleges, 74%, to grades in all courses. And if you look at the first three things that they took into account, it's grades in college prep courses, and strength of curriculum, in other words, context about your grades. And this is going to stay the same. And so there's a new report, a version of this report that's coming out, hopefully in the next month or so, and we'll be sure to share it out. But mostly colleges care about grades. It used to be, back in 2017, that schools cared about test scores. But as you probably heard, a lot of schools are test optional or test blind right now, which means that they either test optional, they're like, you can submit it if you want, if it helps, or they're test blind, which is like, we're not even going to look at scores, so don't even send them, like the University of California system. So because so many schools have gone test optional and test blind, essentially scores have become less important, and they're valuing other things. Now, we don't know exactly what the colleges are going to report in the next month or two, like what they feel like are most important. But as of a few years ago, the next thing they cared about was essays. After that, demonstrated interest, which is a separate webinar topic, but it's essentially like letting the school know for some schools that you're interested in attending. And by the way, Not every school gives considerable importance. Only 16% gives considerable importance. And some schools give no importance to demonstrated interest. But this is sort of like, in terms of the ranking, something that some schools care about. And then your recommendation letters from your counselor or teacher. 9% of schools give considerable importance to class rank. Most of them are in moderate or limited importance. Extracurricular activities, and then things like your portfolio, interview, work, etc. So that's kind of like a broad overview of like what colleges are looking for. But you might be wondering, what does this have to do with my application? Well, when it comes time to applying, you're going to be using something called the Common App, probably. That's the most popular one. There's also something called the Coalition App, and these usually open up right around August. And what this is one application that you're going to fill in your information, and you're going to put in your main personal statement, and you're going to fill in your activities, which is to say your brag sheet, and your additional information, like what other stuff do you want them to know. And you're going to put that all in this one platform. And that platform is what you're going to use to apply to many of the, for example, private schools that you might be applying to. And I know for some of you, this sounds kind of basic, but for some of you, it's like, oh, cool, that was good to know. We've got a whole guide, by the way, that we'll share in the chat for like how to fill out the Common App. So that's sort of the first part. Now, whatever you put in that information is going to be common to all schools. That's the Common App. But each of those schools has their own questions and essays and preferences. So it could be that you apply to Michigan and they're like, great, thanks for all this information. We also have these other 2 questions. And those other 2 questions might have a word limit of, say, 500 words or 250 words. And those are what we call supplemental essays. So again, big picture, what we're talking about today is what are those different elements in the Common App? And then what are these supplemental essays and what do they look like? And so we're going to take one kind of like, each one at a time. The first thing I want to talk about is the activities list. So this is like your brag sheet. I'm going to kick it over to Tom here for a minute to share with you what is this activities list and what are some tips for standing out and making the most of it. Because I think sometimes people think, oh yeah, I'll just put in these activities and it'll be fine. But, sometimes students, I think, miss opportunities here. So Tom, tell us about the activities list.
Okay, absolutely. Let me go ahead. I have some slides for this. That can always be fun. Some slides. Hopefully they look okay. They look beautiful, actually. Like, oh my gosh, stunning. Amazing. So on brand. So when it comes to activities and honors with your application, that is actually when we did the student survey poll, yet another plug. If you have not done that yet, it's in the yellow box at the top of your chat. The areas behind, we asked students, all of you attending, what are the areas that you need or are hoping for the most support with when it comes to your college process? And beyond, of course, your personal statement and your supplemental essays in your application, which are, maybe the reason why you're here. College list building, so putting together the list of schools that you decide you want to apply to, and extracurricular activities with a 2-second kind of, I guess, tier of areas that are of a big concern to students right now. And I think in my experience working with high school students, the idea is that, I don't really know what colleges want to see or what activities are really going to push me over the edge in these college application pools where I know a lot of the students who are applying have really strong grades and possibly really strong scores if they sent those in. And I just feel like these are the things that could possibly differentiate me. And I think rooting kind of your decision-making in that process, one thing that I will say is that most students who apply to these colleges, there are going to be similar activities on students' applications by and large, because most high schools offer a similar kind of range of things, right? It's yes, some schools might have a special, like, farm club where you actually go out and milk cows. There's a school actually in Vermont called the Putney School where they do kind of exactly that. But most schools, by and large, are going to have things like a National Honor Society or a drama club or athletic teams, and students might play on a varsity or a junior varsity, and maybe they have some leadership in those areas. So in general, I would say that most of the offerings that are part of your high school are great. They're great ways for you to make friends, to build connections and community with people who you have like-minded interests with, which is something that colleges are actively interested in students who can contribute not just to the classroom, but to a residential community more broadly, and have things to contribute, whether that's on the newspaper or I'm trying not to miss all the buckets, but whatever you're into, there's a space for that at these colleges, right? There's not a void there. What I do think that a lot of students spend a lot of time thinking of is that more is better. And I think a lot of students, because they just want to stand out in some way, they want to kind of add on things beyond kind of maybe the more standard offerings. And in my experience, I would say most high school students don't really have the bandwidth or capacity to commit to more than 3, maybe 4 activities in high school really robustly, right? It's just not mathematically possible. You don't have enough hours in a day to be captain or leader of every single club and activity that your school offers. So pressuring yourself to do that, I think, is really unrealistic, and I actually don't think is necessary. I would say the majority of students who are admitted at the schools that I worked at, which are Pomona College and College of the Holy Cross, both of which are selective schools where we had a lot of really highly qualified applicants. I'd say even the ones who are being admitted, most of them only had like 3 or 4 main activities that were a lot of kind of basically what ate up, or not ate up their time, but they spent their time doing. So hearing that might be kind of like, wow, I'm really surprised because the Common App has 10 spaces. Sometimes students have started out doing something in like 9th or 10th grade and they don't continue on with it. In fact, that's actually super, super common. And I know some students may be like, but what about consistency and continuity and showing that I'm committed? You can definitely show that with the things that you have that in, but it's also super natural and developmentally appropriate to be like, I tried 9th grade tennis and it was not my gig. You know, I'm forehand, backhand, goodbye hand to that. Okay. So it's very normal, very fine to be able to step away from things that are just not filling your cup as much. And in fact, colleges value students kind of narrowing down the focus and figuring out like, this is the area where I feel the most impactful. I feel like I'm making the most change. I feel like I'm myself as much as possible. And that's a really beautiful thing to see in a student. So yeah, I'd say 3 to 4 kind of main ones is great. On your activities list, you know, there are many schools. So for example, MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, they actually only ask for 5 spaces. And sometimes students panic and are like, but I have so many more things. But I think MIT has kind of cracked the code. Hey, because STEM, on the reality that there's just not really going to be, more is not really going to be better when it comes to your application. What I will say though, yeah.
Sorry, quick side note. I want to say that like students feel pressure, or if you're feeling pressure to fill in all 10, know that like the average student puts in like 5 activities. So don't feel like you got to fill them all in. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And activities can be things that are like more one-off, right? Like, or things that are not a formal activity in your school. It can be taking care of siblings. If you're someone who has to like drive your siblings to and from elementary school after school, that's spending your time. I think a good way to think about what counts in the activities list is to basically think about your life outside of your classes, your academics, as like a pie chart. And like, what does a week in the life of Tom look like when it comes to the way I'm spending my time? There are certain things you don't need to mention, like sleeping, eating, you know, maybe chores. You know, it can be like, I'm the pro, you know, trash wrangler in my house, but don't forget the recycling. You know, we have room for her too. So I'd say those things don't need to be in there. But if there are other ways that are spending your time in your community that maybe don't seem like formal activities, but are things that you pursue really independently, like maybe you binge a lot of podcasts or YouTube videos on whales. And it's funny, I usually want to share a video in the chat of Beyonce about how much she loves whales. Fun fact, if you didn't know that, she does. And that, who doesn't? They're fascinating and also like so old. Anyway, so if you have something that you're really kind of pursuing on your own, in fact, I would say those are really interesting to include. And sometimes students really don't think that because they're like, oh, that's just me in bed scrolling through my phone or listening to podcasts. But those are showing curiosities that you've developed that colleges can really see and translate in a student contributing to classes in a more dynamic and robust way. I'd say some of the other things that I kind of want to mention here on this slide before moving on to the next one is the impact, focus, and quantifiable piece. So if you're applying to schools and you have been involved in an activity where, say, you've been able to reach, you know, we implemented a tutoring program in elementary schools and we were able to reach X number of students. If you do have activities that you've been involved in, this is not to say you have to do this, but if you have activities that show some kind of larger quantifiable impact, I would say that it's often great to show admissions officers what that looks like, because it gives a sense of scale to people in admissions who, like, if you're doing things on a state or regional or national level, and your message or your work is impacting a certain number of people, I think that's a great thing to weave into your process. This is just something that I know on the slide before, there was an example of basically self-directed projects or initiatives that are kind of beyond the brick and mortar, the walls of your high school. And these are some examples that you see here on the screen of things that students have done in the past, of applications that I've read who were successfully admitted at both the schools that I've worked at, or other schools, other high school students that I've worked with. And one thing I want to note is that sometimes it can be like looking at this like, wow, like a lot of these seem like you need to spend a lot of money to potentially do some of these things. Most of these initiatives were actually completed by low-income students that I've worked with in the past, or who applied to Pomona or to Holy Cross. So I just want to note that, because especially in the age of the internet, there's so many ways that you can learn and lean into your intellectual curiosities, or just into things that you want to do that don't involve spending a lot of money. And of course, there are resources like College Essay Guy that translate to other areas that are offering ways for you to be able to make that impact, but doing it in a way that doesn't necessarily feel like you have to shell out tons of money to stand out in these pools. Because, sometimes students may feel like, oh, I need to do a research project, or I need to pay for an internship or whatnot. And those things can definitely add a lot of dynamic quality to your application, but they're not a requirement by any means. And I wouldn't say that admissions officers have a hierarchy of certain experiences over others. I would say that they're intrigued and they are struck by these kind of more self-directed projects, because it shows initiative, it shows entrepreneurship, it shows an unabashed willingness to lean into something that you care about. So one, for example, the second bullet that you see here about the kid who was into his podcast about ants, that was like something that really stood out to me about this particular student, because he came from kind of an environment where most of the students did, for lack of a better term, kind of more traditional high school activities. And the way that the school was talking about him was like, he is definitely very anomalous, and he spends so much of his time like recording and researching and editing everything about ants. And I remember even in the recommendation, one of the counselor was like, he has like 0 followers and listeners. And I don't exactly know who the audience is of this podcast, but like even the fact that he's just like putting himself out there so vulnerably and rawly, and just like leaning into it and being like, if you don't like ants, so be it. Like, if you're a caterpillar kid, I don't have time for you. No, he's not doing it in a way like that. But I think showing that kind of spirit of just like, hey, this is who I am. And you may not have seen this before or really get why I'm doing this, but let me show you and share with you why it fills my cup so much. I think those moments are things that really, really excite and entice admissions officers in a landscape where a lot of students are good at talking about what they do, but they don't get as much into the why behind it. So I think whenever you have an opportunity to do that, and in fact, that's a great segue for supplemental essays, which we'll talk about in a second. That's a really great space. 2 real quick things before we move on to the next section. As we kind of already mentioned, this is a little bit of a recap. Don't feel pressured to fill in all 10 of those spaces. You really don't have to do that. In fact, I said MIT asked for 5. Look, they even asked for 4. They even asked for less than what I thought, right? So less is more, truly. And I would also say that a big piece of advice that I really want to drill home here is that I've worked with students over the years and I was this student. I was like, well, I do band camp I never did band camp, but as a hypothetical, I did band camp for 2 hours in the summer, but then we had winter break where we did it for a half hour on Wednesdays, but we did it for 20 minutes on Thursdays. So I don't really know what to put down for the hours per week and weeks per year that the common application is asking for me. Just put the average. Again, what the admissions officer wants to see is generally a pie chart of like how you're spending your time. Is it 30% drama, 20% soccer, 10% podcast about whales? Just kind of communicate that message with the math that you put out there. And if the math isn't mathing, if it isn't letter perfect, there's not going to be this kind of audit into the hours so minutely. It's kind of one of those things that students and families spend a lot of stress on, but someone in the admissions team just generally wants that kind of larger ballpark picture. So just make sure that don't feel so stressed out by that particular area of the process. It will save you a lot of mental energy, and you can focus on things that are more important. And on this last kind of slide here, on the don't forget it side of things, so instead of don't sweat it, this is the don't forget it, things that I think could actually really add a lot of value to your application. Students can oftentimes, and we talked about this a little bit on last webinar on Tuesday, students can often feel a little pressured to present a more formal tone to admissions offices, because sometimes I think they want to appear a little more neutral, and they're afraid of setting off the admissions officer or being seen as not taking this process seriously. And what I will say about that is that your application shows a lot of serious commitment to your academics, to your impact in your school. That seriousness is communicated in many different spaces. But I would say actually being able to show personality and lightness in your activities list is a great underutilized space to be able to kind of showcase your voice. And maybe you kind of are someone who's a little more quirky, have more quirky interests. Maybe you're someone who's more straightforward and you kind of are just more comfortable just being like, hey, this is what I do, no frills, and this is just the type of person that I am. Lean into the person that you are. And if that's kind of someone who is a little more casual and light, that's great, because this can definitely be a space to kind of really flex that. But also, if you want to do the more straightforward route, there's no kind of real harm in that. But I would say that kind of leaning into it a little bit does, I think, give you a certain element of distinction. And I will give actually an example of this, just to kind of like, and this is a good question to ask yourself. And I kind of already mentioned this, but like, what have you chosen to spend your time doing and why? So if you're able to communicate in your descriptions for your activities, the why behind what you do, as opposed to just the facts of like, you know, it's NHS, we commit to service and kind of show why you have committed to the certain projects that you have, or why you even spend time doing that in general, or what are kind of some of the larger lessons that you've learned from those particular activities. So this list here is one that I've shown a lot on previous webinars, but as juniors, you may not have seen those before. So you may be kind of surprised by kind of the level of like candor and lightness that this student is revealing in his application. So for example, on the second one, track and field, instead of just writing "we run," which sure, I would expect that. But he says, I can't sprint, so I run lots of slower circles instead of fewer faster circles, leading by example in a shockingly popular circle running team. So it's quirky, it's fun, it's a little different than just the standard way of describing it. So that's one activity where, because it's a little more like obvious what it is, you can kind of be a little more, I'd say, creative and fun with the way that you present it. But in ones where you actually need to describe and illustrate and inform who's on the other end, who may not know what that activity is. So for example, the writing center coach, it is a little obvious, or you know, you can kind of get a sense for what that might entail for this particular student. But I like that he says, like, nominated by CEG, humanities faculty, coaches help peers write and edit academic, analytical, and creative works. There's a sense of kind of like, there's a slight sense of like, I was nominated for this leadership position in the school to be able to impact my peers and help them write better. So there's areas that the student is leaning into where they're doing that like humble bragging, like, yeah, like this is something I'm really proud of. And, you know, it's showcasing a skill and a talent that I have. But then there's other kind of more light ones that kind of are folded into the mix. So it's okay to kind of just stagger them back and forth, if that makes sense. I hope some of this insight was helpful to you as you start to think about the way to not just choose activities, but the way to kind of communicate how they've been impactful to you, to admissions offices, because I think the how and the why, and not just the what, are really kind of two questions that you want to spend some time reflecting on.
Lovely. I'm going to answer 5 questions in 1 minute, and I'm going to pick 5 random questions from the chat. So I'm doing leadership at school clubs. Instead, I'm doing outside activities like being a figure skating coach. Do colleges view it as leadership? They do. In fact, just make sure, Wendy, when you're putting in your application that you clarify, you show them how it's leadership. And you can do that in the activities list or in the additional info section, which I'll explain about in just a second. Priyanka asked, do I need to fill all 20 places on the UC application? You do not. They're trying to be like, you know, give you opportunities, but don't feel stressed about it. What happens if you have straight A's all years except one? First of all, congrats on crushing it. Second of all, just if there's something, anybody who's got grades that you need to explain, you can explain this also in your additional info section, which we'll talk about in a second. Elizabeth, is it worth trying to do more extracurriculars this summer? Is it too late? It's not too late. It's not even summer yet. So go do things that you find, you know, that bring you joy, that are interesting, that keep you engaged. It's not too late at all. One more, I think, I don't know if it's 5 or 6. Chloe asked, does that mean QuestBridge's app of 5 activities won't necessarily hinder your application? No, not at all. QuestBridge is awesome. Fill it out. It's great. You're not going to be like, you know, penalized by filling out one. And then, okay, one more. Common App versus Coalition App. We're talking about a Common App because more students fill that out, but it's Coalition App, same deal. The word limits might be slightly different, but if you're using Coalition, you're good.
I used to read all 3 in my previous roles, so there really is no preference to them. Whichever one feels the most appropriate to you.
So here we go. So what is this additional information section we're talking about? We have a whole guide on this, and with lots of examples. And essentially, let me show you what it looks like inside the actual Common App. It's where it says in the writing section, additional information. By the way, it could look a little different in a couple months in case maybe they've updated their platform. But here's what you should put in there. So I'm not going to go through all the things that you could put in there. And quick note, if you listen to this and you start to get stressed, just know that you do not have to put anything in your additional info section. This is totally optional. And this is only if any of these things apply to you. So don't be like, what? This is part of the arms race of applying to college. No, it's not. It's not about that. But if you do have some activity that you want to talk about that you're like, it's just not coming through in this tiny little description for my, activity. For example, the student did a fundraiser and was like, you know what? I want to share some more context. If you want, you can keyword selectively share a few bullet points of what you did. So we raised this amount of money to go to this particular place. Someone asked in the chat also, how do you show impact? Like this, in the additional info section, what was the money for? Where did it go? What else did it inspire? You can put all of these kinds of numbers inside your additional info. And you won't have to put them in your personal statement. Sometimes students are like, I got to prove myself in my personal statement. And we are of the belief that if you can do an awesome activities list and additional info section, then you can kind of relax and let the resume do the work. And you can just like in your personal statement, like show up in jeans, as it were, and be you. Make sure that you're brief, specific, that you put details in orders, a descending order of importance. Someone asked in the chat also, I think I'm up to 9 questions, asked, should we order, or does the Common App order them? And I would say, just broadly speaking, put the most important stuff at the top and less important stuff at the bottom, but don't obsess. This is one of those don't sweat it things like Tom was talking about, where like the difference between should I put this third or fourth, or should I put this fourth and this third, like they're going to be probably scanning pretty quickly. So just most important stuff at the top, maybe the most important thing that you want to lead with at the very top, less important stuff further down. Other stuff that you can put here is health concerns. So if you or a member of your family have experienced health-related concerns that have impacted your academics or getting involved in things, you can put that in there. Focus on info, impact, and I think it's okay even if your counselor is putting this in their letter. If you're talking about mental health issues, this is a fine place to do it. Just make sure, again, to like talk to your counselor. And if you want to, you can do it in this simple format where you go, here's the challenge I experienced. The next bullet point, here's the way it impacted me. Here's what I did about it. And then here's what I learned through the experience. So challenge, impact or effect, what I did, what I learned, put those in your additional info. And then you can talk about whatever else you want in your personal statement or in your supplemental essays. Let's do 2 more. One is like if you've got red flags in your application where you're like, somebody mentioned, I got bad grades. It sounds like you just got a B. If you just got a B, you don't need to explain that. But if you got like, you had straight A's and then suddenly you had straight C's, yeah, they're going to be like, what happened? So you can explain that briefly with, again, simple bullet points or a simple few sentences. And then the last thing, but this is not necessary, if there are certain experiences that you've had that have made it difficult for you to be involved in extracurricular activities, that is maybe unique to your situation. So I'm not talking about COVID, because COVID made it hard for a lot of people, a lot of us, to get involved in a lot of things. But I'm talking about, for example, students that we've known who, couldn't get rides to after school activities, or maybe they had to be home before dark because, in their neighborhood, it wasn't necessarily safe. So they weren't able to participate. If there are things like that and you want to communicate, that's great. But I'm not talking about I wasn't able to do my third research project because, no, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about situations that are very particular to you and that help give context. And if you're curious about what these things are, talk to your counselor, because your counselor is an awesome resource for this and will help give you a sense of yes, maybe include that, or yeah, maybe don't include that. And we'll also say that even though we're spending, 3 to 5 minutes talking about additional info, some counselors are not fans of using this section at all. And they'll say to you, and I get it, they'll say, don't put anything in there. And by the way, that's a totally fine approach. And awesome students get into awesome schools every year, keeping this section totally blank. Okay. So I know this sounds like we're kind of giving you 2 sets of advice, but we want to paradox. Hey, life is hard. We're saying to you, if you want to use this section, you can. And also you don't have to, and you can still get into an awesome school. I hope that's not too confusing. And we're trying to sort of allow you to hold that complexity. Tom, thoughts on additional info section? You might have been handling the chat like a boss.
Just sprinkling in a few answers here and there. But yeah, in general, I would say typically, I think the best way to think about the additional information section is that this is truly the free space of your board game, of your college application, right? You can use this the way that you want to. I would say there are generally more effective ways to use it. I think sometimes when students say, for example, they want to elaborate on all of their activities and they want to use the additional information space for that. Typically, there isn't a need, for example, to give 4 additional bullets of your involvement with basketball, right? Usually the 150 character description in the common application gives you enough. It can be tight, but it gives you enough space to generally share what your role is on that team. So it's more effective, for example, to say like, oh, I'm like the kid with the Band-Aid on the team because I'm like the team dad and I'm always like, taping up the bruised knees. That's like a way to kind of use that description to kind of showcase your values and kind of your particular contribution to an activity. But you don't need to kind of go through a whole rundown of like, this is our schedule every day. And, this is kind of what, my friend group that I had the next year compared to the first year. That kind of gets a little too in the weeds because you have to remember that people in admissions are reading these applications rather quickly. They're not kind of spending hours and hours dissecting with a fine tooth comb through like all of your words that you write down. Students think that and kind of, I think, pressure themselves and really can get paralyzed with like, oh, I don't know whether to choose this sentence for the ending to my essay. And usually both will accomplish the general same, message or results. And with additional info, I would say, yeah, really the biggest areas are kind of any extenuating circumstances. So like if you were to say like, oh, I really wish I had a chance to talk to someone in person about X, chances are that's a good it's a good rationale for including that type of disclosure, family issues, personal challenges, illnesses, whatever it may be to the college, because if they don't know that information, they might not be making a complete picture or assessment of your application, or maybe kind of having to just make inferences around, oh, well, there was a huge dip in grades during sophomore year, but like, we don't really know why. So we kind of have to pass on the student without really factoring in what could have been happening behind the scenes.
Lovely. I'm going to answer 5 more questions in 1 minute. Grace asks about social media accounts. So if you've got social media stuff you've done, super awesome. Feel free to include the accounts and like the number of followers if that's impressive. But also you don't have to. You could just say, here, I've got a social media account, and you can speak about it generally and just leave it at that. Tom, what percentage of the time at Pomona did you actually click on to look at the social media account of a student when you were reading applications?
I would say it was overall probably about half, but I would say it would depend on kind of where they fell in the reading review process. At Pomona, kind of there's like a first kind of phase of reviewing that is usually a little more quick. And sometimes I'd be able to pull up accounts that to me just like looked really interesting. Like I remember vividly there was this one where I was reading the application with my colleague Chris, and it was like this student who had like little bite-sized art. And just the way she wrote about it in her additional info, I was like, I really want to check this out. So I just plugged in the account name into my own Instagram. And I was like, Chris, you have to look at this art. It's so cool. I've never seen anything like this before. And then when she actually came up again during committee later on, like months later, I was like, oh, this is the bite-sized burger, little cute art kid. I don't know if she ended up getting admitted in the end or not, but sometimes it just kind of depends again on the personal preference of the admissions officer that certain things may catch their eye more than others. And there's really no control that you have over how the person on the other end is going to receive that information, but it doesn't hurt to include it because there is a chance that they will check it out at some phase in the process. So
I'm imagining, so a couple more things, a couple more questions, and then I'll get back into the other additional info sections. One, Tessa's asking, when do colleges release their specific supplemental essays? Usually August 1st to 15th. How do we highlight summer courses? Does that go in activities? It can go in the additional info. Some like applications, for example, the University of California schools will have a place to put in that and to enter those. But if not, if there's anything that you're like, I don't know where to put this in the application, it could be that it goes in the additional info, and that's fine. Just be direct, short, informational. I think that was 5. Yeah, homeschooling. Oh, somebody asked about homeschooling. I've got a whole podcast on that with a whole bunch of resources. Check it out. I put the link in. All right. So the next additional info section is the COVID section. And I'm not going to spend a whole ton of time on this, but suffice to say, if you have experienced difficulties related to COVID, somebody mentioned long COVID, this is the place to put that. And here's what it looks like in the application. It's got a 250 word space, and you can be really straightforward and direct with this. What should you put in there? Here's a list of non-exhaustive list of things that you could put in there. And the way it looks is really just straightforward. So it can be bullet points. I come from a low income family. We weren't prepared for the challenges the pandemic threw at us. Here were the challenges. Here's what we did about it. But here's what I learned. I learned about flexibility and how important it is to communicate with my family. And again, like literal bullet points are totally fine here. So don't stress. Don't think you have to write like a work of art. They're really just, it's called the additional info. They're looking for info. So it doesn't have to be beautiful, perfect, etc. As far as supplemental essays go, there are a lot of different kinds of supplemental essays, but one of the most popular ones that I want to touch on briefly is the Why This College essay. Because in my view, it's not only one of the ones that's most popular, but it's one of the ones that can be the most important. In fact, some schools will say that it is in some cases even more important than the personal statement because it helps to demonstrate how you would be a fit. And also, if you would be likely to attend that school if you were accepted. So some quick tips on the Why This College essay. First of all, I wouldn't write necessarily about the school's size, location, reputation, weather, or the ranking. In fact, there was a whole prompt that Emory put together once that said, yes, many students decide to apply to Emory based on our size, location, reputation, and yes, the weather. Besides these valid reasons, why is Emory a good match for you? And then Georgia Tech used to ask, beyond rankings, location, athletics, why are you interested in attending Georgia Tech? It's obvious, that they're tired of reading about those things. So take a hint from past students and from past prompts. I should say from past, it's really the prompts that you're taking a hint from, that these aren't things that colleges are necessarily going to be super excited to hear more about. The other thing that I would say, let me stop sharing and reshare, because then you'll see the actual tab that I'm sharing. There we go. Okay. The other thing is like simply using what I call emotional language to demonstrate fit. So sometimes students write YS essays and they're like, when I stepped on campus, I just knew this was the place for me. And then you're like, okay, I'm taking your word for it so far. But what you really need is to do lots of research to figure out what are the particulars of the school and how, not just like this class is so awesome, but like, what the heck does it have to do with you? Because what you're doing is you're making a case in your YS essay. You're making a case for you, college, and me, Ethan, are a perfect fit. And we are explosion heart emojis. But you can't just be like, trust me, we're a great fit. You've got to give specific evidence. So if you're trying to make the case for like why, for example, USC is an awesome, University of Southern California is an awesome school, you can't just name like awesome stuff about USC. It's kind of like, I like to say that it's like being on a first date, and you can't just be like, you are well regarded in many different scenarios, and my aunt thinks you're amazing. No, it's like, what is the specific offering, the specific course, the specific thing that you really vibe with. And it's not just like, I can't wait to wear, red and yellow. And by the way, don't call them that if you're applying to USC, because they're going to be like, we're not red and yellow. But look at the school colors. That's a tiny note. But, just make sure that you're doing your research for these. That's probably my biggest note. The other thing is sometimes students will go to the website and they'll basically like say back what the website language is. And it's like, I too am committed to diversity. And it's like, okay, yeah, I mean, that's a good sentiment, but what are the specific things from your life that show your commitment to the thing that the school values? So for example, if the school says, we're committed to the life of the mind, what does the life of the mind mean to you? And how does it manifest in your life? And the more specifics that you can get there, and by specifics, I mean, here's the test, is when you go through your essay, are there any sentences that someone else could have written? Because if so, you can cut those and write new sentences or rewrite those. And if you can have in your, let's say it's a 250-word essay, sentences that nobody else could have written, that's probably a good sign that this is good, that you've gotten specific enough on yourself and what the school is into. The other thing I would say, just to give one more, like a fifth tip, is oftentimes students think of this as like, let me let the school know that I did some research. But usually it's like based on a Google search of like top traditions at the school. And I just want to say that if you're applying to like, Stanford and you're talking about jumping in the fountain, or you're applying to Northwestern and you're talking about like Dillo Day, like they're going to have read that. So I would put that in the category of things that they're like, besides these things. And I know that seems like kind of hard and it's going to take you a little bit more research, but it's totally doable. And I'll say this, once you do it for one of those schools and it's like a longer essay and you've done the work for it, it's going to be easier to do it for the others once you've kind of found your flow and your format on those. Any like quick things to add in, and then I want to segue into Q&A. Yeah,
I think one of the things I would mention with the Why Us is, I remember working with a student this past year who was like, don't you feel like colleges are kind of getting sick of like the formula of like, okay, I'm going to add in a course and a professor and make it specific and call it a day? Because, many students are going to be including those things. But what I told the student is that you may think that everyone's doing that, but actually in the broader application pool, you'd be surprised at how many people are keeping it really general and really surface level. So those levels of specific, I would say, are not as present with the entire applicant pool. Maybe if you go to a school where, the kids are thinking about this a lot more than just, junior and senior year, perhaps. But the other thing that I would say is that the why us questions, while they can kind of feel a little like tedious in a way, or kind of like, you should know why I'm applying here, it's a great school, right? They know that, but what I think people on the other end are hoping to see is it's really electric when, for example, like students will write in and say like, hey, I was looking at your professors for your particular bio department versus others, and you have an expert in ornithology, and I love birds, and it's just not something that I commonly see even at other schools that are similar to what I'm looking for. So because of experts that are on your on staff, or I looked at the courses that are offered, and this one is like one that is a topic that's really it connects to me in some particular way. Sometimes you can actually even weed out schools by doing research on your why us that like, actually I'm like looking through the department and like, it doesn't really look like that exciting to me. That could be a good reason to maybe like take that school off your list and not even bother sending in the $70 application fee and writing a whole other essay when you realize by doing this research, hey, it actually might not be as good of a match as I thought it was. So in a way, yes, maybe some of these questions can kind of seem like, oh, I feel like this is more obvious. But I actually think that you can learn a lot by doing it. And you can actually sometimes make you more excited for the school too. Because I've worked with students who are like, oh my God, I was actually doing research for my why us. And like, there's this particular program for computer science in Budapest that like sounds so cool. And I've always wanted to go there because my mom's sister went, and like, it'd be such a great opportunity. So it can actually make you even more excited to attend some of these schools, which in the process that can feel like a lot and kind of a slog at certain points. I don't want to romanticize it all and be like, it's all about self-discovery at every single waking second of the day. Because there's definitely space for that. And we feel, very much at College Essay Guy that there is. But I would say that when you have those kind of unexpected moments of like, charge that come upon like something that you stumble upon, whether that's on the school's Instagram feed, you're like, oh my God, I saw a student takeover of a student who's super into insert more specific thing that I'm into that I didn't think a lot of other people are. And that makes me so much more excited to go and potentially attend that school because I see this point of connection. So it can actually just give you that jolt of energy that you sometimes might need in going through this.
Yeah, great points. One of the things that as I'm reading some of the questions from the chat, and I'm going to answer a few more here in a second, that that we're really big fans of is asking the filtering question of what can I control in this situation? Or another version of asking that is like, is there anything that I can control? What can I control? Is there anything I can control? So an example of this, is students asking things like, what if I haven't done certain activities? Is that bad? And like, my answer is like, well, you can't go back in time to like do, things. So what can you control? Well, you can do some activities, and then you can write about them on your application in ways that help them stand out. And then, apply to a broad range of schools so that you're not only, for example, like, making your success based on like, do you get into Stanford or not? And because I think that students, whether they knowingly do this or not, they're putting their definition of success on getting into a highly rejected school or not, right? So like Stanford has like less than 5%. If you take in legacy, athletes, et cetera, it's like 2%. And then if you're an international student, it's like point something percent. Like, don't set yourself up for disappointment by being like, I will only be happy if I get into Stanford. Like, you've got so much time right now to develop a broad range. And there's so many schools out there that not only will accept you, but will give you money to go. And there are, stats around this, but like most colleges in the US accept most students. It's something like 67% is like the average acceptance rate. So really, it's just a matter of doing a little bit of extra research and going beyond the schools that you've heard of because they're popular or they're on US News and World Report, or like you've seen them play on TV, because of sports, because of the sports. Some of these things. So like Shreya asked, do some colleges say they're test optional, but they actually prefer students with tests? So I'm going to use that question and throw it back at you. What can you control? We can't control. By the way, I tend to think that if schools are saying we are truly test optional, I take them at their word. But stepping back from it, like, what can you control? Do you prepare for the test or not? Do you take the test or not? Do you submit your test scores? Like, those are all separate decision points that you can make along the way. So you don't need to decide right now, am I going to submit my scores or not? All you need to ask yourself is like, today, do I want to prep for the test? And then, or do I want to create a plan to prep for the test, for example? Vita's asking, if you're involved in more activities outside of school than within school, is that necessarily bad? Again, same response. It's like, can you control that? Like, that's you, that's your application. So how do you turn that into a strength and make sure the colleges see the awesome skills, qualities, values, and interests that have manifested in your life based on the decision you made to do stuff outside of school? Clarify that. Like, what is it that's motivated you to do stuff outside of school? What opportunities have you seen? You can turn that into a positive really easily. Rachel, your question about my child is passionate about origami but wants to study medicine. I want to get to that in just a second. Let me do a quick PSA because I told folks that I would share more about this, about our courses that are happening this summer, and then I'm going to get into your question. And let me just show y'all what this is. So basically, again, these courses are pay what you can, but I'm releasing this how to write a personal statement course. And if I recommended like, sort of like what is the sort of recommended timeline? This is when I would recommend literally like working on your essays. So the way it'll work is June 8th, we'll gather together live just on a session like this. We'll go through the brainstorming exercises. I'm going to guide you through those step by step. You'll have coming out of that first session some pretty good ideas of some things to work on that you want to, like essay ideas. And then one of the things that I do is I'm sharing with you something called our Choose Your Own Adventure tool. And let me just stop sharing my screen for a second and I will share that so you can see what this is. But essentially the Choose Your Own Adventure tool is this really rad, essentially a curriculum that's going to answer a whole bunch of questions. Everything from like, when I'm trying to outline, how do I outline my essay? And I've got like 8 different, paths for you. In terms of writing your first draft, I've got different like, advice for that. How do you revise? How do you come up with great openings? How do I figure out what my transitions are? And then this is going to be overwhelming, but this is like the whole table of contents. This is essentially the curriculum that I use that you get access to. It's going to answer all your questions. And then, essentially over the next couple of weeks, we get into outlining, we get into revising and then refining so that by the end of that month, you should have a pretty solid draft done, at least knock on wood. That's my hope. And then right after that, we segue into some of the stuff that we've been talking about, but a lot more specific. So in terms of your application, we're talking specifically about, we go big picture and we go, okay, what are the different pieces of my application? Now that I know what my personal statement is and how do I specifically focus on what sides of myself to show? So we've got 3, different processes that we suggest for the activities list that take you anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour and a half, but hopefully not 10 hours to make sure that's in great shape. We walk specifically through and you get lots of time to ask questions on your additional info section. And then we go through any essays, any, supplemental essays that you want to talk about. Now, you might be like, wait, Ethan, didn't you say those are released in August? Yes, but one of the things we'll talk about is that a lot of the essays stay the same from year to year. And you can kind of know, and I'll share with you, which ones are probably going to stay the same. We can't with 100% certainty know, but part of why we do it in July is that you can save yourself a whole bunch of time and start to work ahead on what we call super essays that you can use through lots of different parts of the application. Another thing, so anyway, we've got links to that in the chat. Another thing that we do that a lot of people don't know about, but just to give you a heads up, is for students who are low income, we offer basically free essay and application support. So if that's something that you're interested in, we pair you with an awesome counselor. It's totally free. You have to, fill out some information that shows that you're qualified for low income. And that's a real offer. There's no catch there. We're not selling your data or anything. It's just like, yeah, we want to help. And we've got a lot of counselors who can help. And then for those of you who are also interested, if you want to pay for help, we do comprehensive like one-on-one help for students. And so we're happy to tell you more about that. And we'll put links in the chat. All right. To your question, Rachel, and then I'm going to kick it to Tom to answer some questions. Tom, you can feel free to do one deep or just do a few. So Rachel, your child is passionate about origami but wants to study medicine. Whenever I hear this, I get super excited because I'm like, that's going to be such a more interesting essay on why I want to study medicine. And here's my quick tips on this is whenever, and this is for anybody who's got like a thing that I like to do, but doesn't seem like it goes with the thing that I want to study. You can brainstorm briefly using the jellyfish exercise that I did on Tuesday. So go back and watch that video. What are some values that your child would connect to origami? What are some of those qualities that they've learned? Maybe being detail oriented, maybe being, creative. I'm just riffing here, right? But what are some different qualities that they've developed doing origami? And could it be that some of those values will serve them in the future doing medicine? Like, I don't know, being creative and like, I don't know, being detail oriented. You see where I'm going with this? So I call this kind of like I don't know, there's different names that I use for it, but what it can do for the essay is we think it's kind of like a magic trick, where we think this is an essay all about origami, and then lo and behold, magically the essay is suddenly about medicine. And we see all along, like in the movie The Sixth Sense, that this was really about, the whole thing was about medicine all along. And all those hints have just been buried along the way. And by hints, I just mean values, things that the student was learning. So my quick advice for your student who I've never met is like, write that darn origami essay and write it in such a way that you're burying the values in the essay. Let me just show you a quick example of this because I'm inspired. You've inspired me, Rachel. Here, let me click back real quick. So there's an essay, for example, inside the tool where a student was writing about, this is in the career essay. Okay. So here's a student who was writing about magic. So he's like, I've been dabbling in the dark arts for 5 years, and he's writing all about different card tricks that he learned. And here's how I got it started with America's Got Talent. And then he's like, then I grew dissatisfied with the full magic routines. I started to develop my own tricks. So you kind of see he's showing his own like ingenuity, his originality. And then I didn't just stop there. I wanted to learn about rock, paper, scissors and the psychology behind why people, why did 2/3 of males choose rock on their first turn? Not content to do that, I started to invent to make people happy, like cooking 3-course meals. So we see invention and originality. And then you've just been fooled by a classic misdirect. Here's the conclusion. For although magic has been my life for so long, what I dream of doing professionally is becoming a neurosurgeon. Surprise. And magic has actually played a big role in this. How? By teaching, taught me to approach life with attention to detail, dexterity, and care, and it's inspired me to invent with passion. So this is kind of like it's not a bait and switch, but it's sort of like hey, look at this, origami, but actually this other thing. So quick tip example. Tom, over to you. What questions have come in that you want to maybe like get into?
Sure. There were a couple of students who asked about major. So Stephanie and Evan both asked about major selection and how that might play a role in your admission process. Funny enough, there's actually a course where I talk a lot about this that we're doing in August about, I think maybe it's like somewhat in the works, but there's also an on-demand version of it. It's called Applying to Highly Selective Colleges and Universities. And I talk a lot about a term called institutional priorities. And essentially what that refers to is these are directives that a college leadership will pass down to the admissions team to say, hey, we want more of X type of student, and we need to actually hold the line with Y type of student in the application pool this year because we have particular goals of the strategic vision and direction that we want the school to go in. Some of them can be really specific, but I would say in recent years, especially if you're looking at some more competitive colleges and universities, your academic interest, I would say does play a role in the conversation in some way, shape, or form at a lot of these schools. Many schools will give you the opportunity to apply as an undecided student. And I think that if that's kind of really truly where you're at right now, you have that option. But I would say some advice that I give is like, I wouldn't think of it as just undecided. I wouldn't have undecided mean the same thing as apathetic, right? You don't want to write in your statement like, I'll just study anything. I haven't really spent any time thinking about it. I'll figure it out when I get there. Sometimes you kind of get that message from students, and it's much harder for an admissions officer to make a case for a student if they aren't giving a more explicit rationale as to why the student should be admitted and what particular areas of campus they will be able to impact. At many schools, it is true that students who are applying to maybe less common academic majors or programs have a more competitive edge in the admission landscape. This tends to be those only more highly selective schools, which again are not the norm in college admission. Like Ethan mentioned, 75% of colleges on the common application admit more than half of their students. So I'm only talking about these schools that are oftentimes the ones that we spend a lot of airtime and time thinking about, because many of the students who come to College Essay Guide for support and who are writing supplemental essays are typically looking at those schools because those are usually the schools that ask those questions. But I would say in general, there is, I do think, especially if you are looking to go into some of those more competitive programs. So in recent years, that has tended to be about business, computer science, engineering. Those kind of stand out to me. Sometimes biology at certain schools. Every school is different and every student is going to be drawn. Oftentimes students and families will Google best schools for insert major and program, and colleges will be flooded with applicants who are interested in those areas because it's the best, right? So something I would think about is just if that is something that you're going towards and you want to pursue, being mindful of the balance of your college list is going to be particularly important, because say you're applying to these most selective colleges and you're applying to the most selective program at that college, it's just like a double whammy of selectivity that you're navigating through. And if you don't meet particular priorities for the school, or there's other areas that come into play in the application process, that is a whole other course that we can talk more about. It is something that you want to make sure to have enough likely schools on your list, because if you're applying to those more competitive programs, like especially in recent years, computer science, if you're only applying to those really, really highly rejected schools, you may be really disappointed in the end come March or the end of your admission cycle with those results because of that level of competition. Yeah. Not to like wrap up the webinar on kind of a sour note, but I think it's good to be realistic and
being real,
to plan ahead. Yeah.
I'd rather y'all be a little bit scared right now and like do stuff about it than, come March, be like, why am I not getting into Stanford and Harvard? And it's like, I'm not saying don't apply to highly selective schools, because it's great to have dreams, but like, there's stuff that you can do. We're such big fans of you having options, and it's so hard to know where you're going to end up getting in. And it's become more, I'm not trying to like freak anybody out. I'm definitely not. It's just become more unpredictable, I think, with many more applications. So whereas we used to be like, apply to 8 schools and you're probably pretty good. And then we were like, maybe 10. And now we're like, maybe 12. It's just, and with international students, I hate to say it, but it can be even harder. So I've seen students apply to like 15 or 20 schools and maybe apply 1 year and they don't get in, but then they try the next year and they do get in. They get into one school that's like, yes, and we will pay you full freight. We'll pay you to come here. So there is hope. It's just, we just want to encourage you to, think about applying broadly. Someone asked about how do you organize? Oh, yes. Tom's putting in the link. So last chance for that book. We're going to give away a book in just a second. So if you'll fill out the form, we would be super grateful. Someone asked about, how do you organize all the information when you're researching stuff? I'm a huge fan of using what I call an essay tracker, which is like, here are the schools that I'm applying to. Here are all the essays required. And then one of the things we'll talk about in the course is like in terms of which topics you choose. And you can find a way to basically overlap your topics. So maybe for your Common App main statement, you're writing about family life and challenges. You can probably reuse that for different essays. And part of like color coding, and you don't have to color code, but part of color coding can help you see like, okay, I'm not actually writing like 50 essays. I'm actually writing like 6 or 10 essays like really well. If we only like big schools like Big Tens, I mean, that's fine, Monica. I guess I'd be curious. We don't have time to have a conversation about it, but like, why only big schools? It's okay to apply to only big schools. And maybe I'm guessing because #the sports, but I don't know. I'm such a fan of like at least visiting other schools to see what the options are out there, because there are rad schools all over. What were you saying, Tom?
Oh, that's funny. I turned the mic off, but I would say if you like Big Ten schools, there are big schools that are not Big Ten schools that will still, I'd say kind of any state flagship school, is going to have a little more of that like school spirit, people recognizing the sweatshirt when you're walking around, and athletic culture, which can be really fun and really dynamic. So there's definitely that exists outside the Big Ten for sure. So I'd say to kind of know that that's something that is guiding and kind of is something that you really want to prioritize with your research, and try to find some alternatives to that in the mix of it.
Yeah. Well, thanks y'all for being here. Before we go, can we randomly select Tom one lucky winner? And I don't know, we kind of blew up the chat last time. I don't know what you said, but everybody was sort of spamming the chat. You do not have to spam the chat. And by the way, anyway, let's just do it. And then maybe we'll stick around.
Yeah, everyone was just saying, I want a book. So, well, I will give folks just a minute or two to wrap up the survey if they haven't done it already. There was one question that I saw from Ashley that was, so should you avoid applying as undecided? I just want to clarify that that's not to say that you cannot apply undecided. I would argue that at those kind of the more selective a school is, typically the more conversation and airtime will be taken up around what you're contributing when it comes to your intellectual, like academic interest. And sometimes they'll be looking at like things that you've done in high school related to that. But every student's application process and file is read differently. It's really rooted in context and kind of where you're coming from. So certain students may not have been able to explore engineering as much based on the high school that they come from or the area that they're in. So all of that is taken into consideration, and admissions officers spend a lot of time contextualizing and thinking about the world that students are coming from. So I definitely want to mention that. So to your question about undecided, some schools are going to care more than others. And so at some schools, they really are totally fine with being undecided, and at others it is, I would say, generally, I would give colleges at this point and you're not committed to this. Like, you're not, at a lot of schools, like, you sometimes are committed to the major you're applying to. At many on your list, you can change your major until the end of your sophomore year. So like, know that there's fluidity and flexibility there. You're not locked into it, but it's usually a good idea to give some bit of a sense of what you're thinking about right now at this point in time, with the caveat and the disclaimer that very may likely will change. In fact, 80% of students change their major at least once in college. So
I did it.
If that happens, totally fine. Yeah, me too. So, all right. So I'm going to refresh the sheet, and I'm going to just scroll up and down on the sheet and randomly click on someone's name, who will then be graced with
if you call your number, if you could just wave it and run to the front of the class, that would be so great.
Okay, 1 second. I know the pressure. I just want to make sure I'm doing it right.
Nyla asked, how can we get started on our essays? Go to the session that we sent on Tuesday, which you'll find in your email, or go to YouTube, the College Essay Guide channel, smash that like button. No, go to the video on 7 personal statement topics. That'll get you started. Are we ready, Tom, or shall I do one more?
We are ready.
All right.
And it's Cattle. Oh, that's a counselor, actually. So Kat, I think probably we're going to do a student. So I'm going to start. I'm going to do it again. We're going to do a student. Sorry, Kat.
The person who asked about legacy, yes, go ahead and mention it. I'm just going to sprinkle in. Go ahead.
Diana Ho. I don't know if Diana's here today.
Diana, you're the next contestant on the college admission prices. I don't know.
If Diana, if you're in the chat, you
win.
Mention your name. But
Tom, final thoughts as we say goodbye to our friends for the moment?
My final thought is I really want to underscore the point that Ethan made about controlling what you can control. I feel like we should be like ease, purpose, joy, and control.
Focusing on control
as the fourth quality to add in. Access and control. There's the 5, the big 5. Who needs the big 10 when you have the big 5, right, Monica? Anyway, I would say so many of the things that spend a lot of, like, students go into bed at night, right? And they think and stir and kind of think about, like, what's someone on the other end thinking? How are they going to, think about this word or this phrase or whatnot? I would say leaning on trusted individuals in your world, in your orbit, or folks like us at College Essay Guide to riff off ideas and to kind of have a thought partner on what you're communicating to colleges. We can kind of help provide insight and context around how some admissions offices and colleges will view these certain areas. But spending all your waking minutes thinking about whether or not people are going to like you, on the other end, I think it's really important to know that, first of all, the decisions are not really based on them liking you or not. In fact, I couldn't admit a lot of students that I really liked as part of my job because I was given specific directives of which students to bring forward to committee and which students, unfortunately, we just had too many that had similar qualities, interests, experiences that I couldn't bring them all forward, right? So there's a lot of things that are happening outside of your control behind the scenes. And I think being aware of those can be scary and can be intimidating, but it's when students are trying to do Nancy Drew detective work and figure out what are the priorities for this school, and I'm going to build together a whole application that curates what I think that they want. You're doing yourself a huge disservice when you do that, because high school and this time in your life should be a chance to make connections, build community, identify what you value, and really, if you have that stronger sense of who you are as you start to embark on this college mission quest thing. It's a Lord of the Rings reference if anyone ever was alive in 2003. And I think that that's going to really kind of have you feeling a lot more ease, purpose, joy as you go through this. It can be really hard to do because I was that student who stirred over and over and over again. So I totally know what it's like. And now on the other side of things, it's something that I wish someone told me to really think about and take a step back from.
Yeah, just to underscore that, I'm going to share with you it's kind of a cheesy meme, but it's actually hopefully kind of funny in this context. Let me see if I can find it. Do you know those? I'm just going to Google it. Do you all know that serenity prayer, which is like, God grant, I'll just say it. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change.
The
The courage to change
the things I can. and the wisdom to know the difference.
Know the difference when it comes to your college application process. So this is from Susan Tree. And I were kind of riffing. She's one of our counselors, and we were talking about how this is like the serenity prayer for college admission. So like, what are those things that you can change, that you can impact? What are those things that you can't? And that's what we're hoping that you'll start to begin thinking about. And, God grant us the wisdom to know the difference. So if you're, and please reach out to your counselor. Your counselor is such a good resource. As a human who's there and who loves you and cares about you and probably misses you and would really value a short conversation with you. So please avail yourself of your high school counselor, because they will help you sort through what you can and can't control. So much love to you all. We'll see you soon. Hope to see some of you on the courses. Again, there's no financial barrier to joining. So join us. Much love and see you soon. Bye.